In the cold kitchen, the sobs of a little girl hugging her brother shattered the silence before her. The stepmother raised the milk bottle like a punishment, not noticing that someone stood in the doorway watching in disbelief. The father had just arrived home earlier than expected. What he was about to discover would not only destroy his trust, but also change his family's destiny forever. What city are you watching this video from? And what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching? Inside the glass-walled office on Fifth Avenue, Alexander Ramirez signed documents as if they were simple, worthless papers. His dark blue suit was perfectly pressed. The Swiss watch gleamed on his wrist, and the distant echo of New York traffic seemed not to affect his mood. He was a man who had achieved everything: buildings in his name, investments in several countries, recognition in business magazines. But when the sun descended behind the Midtown towers and the city lights began to turn on, Alexander felt a persistent emptiness in his chest, like a rumor he couldn't silence with money. That spring afternoon, while observing his reflection in the windows, he briefly recalled the words of his late wife, Clara. She used to tell him that no success was worthwhile if he wasn't willing to share it with those he loved. The image soon faded, replaced by the routine that had consumed him for years. He had learned to live surrounded by luxury, but also by solitude. As he descended to the building's lobby, he greeted the doorman with a quick gesture and headed toward the parking garage. His impeccable black car awaited him. On the drive down Fifth Avenue toward his penthouse, his thoughts wandered between financial statements and upcoming real estate projects in Miami. However, in a corner of his mind, there was a discomfort he didn't want to name. It was as if New York, with its bustling sidewalk cafes and families dining together, reminded him of what he had lost. Upon arriving home, a spacious penthouse near Central Park, silence greeted him with the familiarity of an old enemy. The cold marble, modern lamps, and walls decorated with contemporary art gave the feeling of a museum rather than a home. Alexander left his keys on the glass table and poured himself a glass of California red wine. He stepped out onto the balcony. The streets were filled with people enjoying the early summer festivities, with music and laughter rising to the height of his terrace. He, on the other hand, remained apart as if that joyful New York belonged to another world. While dining alone on a salad prepared by the housekeeper, his mind wandered toward the childhood he never lived as a father. He had a daughter with Clara, but life separated them too soon. After the tragedy, Alexander chose to take refuge in work, hiding the wound beneath layers of success. Neither business dinners nor international trips had been able to cover that void. Later, he turned on the electric fireplace to accompany the stillness of the night. He settled into a leather armchair with an open book he barely read. His face, hardened by years of business, softened for an instant when he heard from the street the echo of a jazz saxophone and some impromptu clapping that reminded him of his youth in Boston, of nights when he dreamed of another life, simple and full of familiar voices around a table. He sighed, shaking his head, as if not wanting to allow himself that weakness. Near midnight, he turned off the lights and walked toward his bedroom. The bedroom was as pristine as the rest of the house. Impeccable white sheets, minimalist furniture, no personal photographs on the nightstands, only a digital clock marking the passage of time. Alexander lay down, and before closing his eyes thought that perhaps life was holding a pending debt for him, something he still didn't understand. What he didn't know was that that feeling of emptiness wasn't a passing whim or a simple memory of Clara. It was a prelude, an echo of what was to come, of an encounter that would forever change the meaning of his existence. That same night, while the city slept, a pair of children's eyes searched for him in silence, preparing to burst into his world of marble and glass. And that unexpected blow to his routine was about to bring down all of Alexander's certainties. That same night, while the city slept, a pair of children's eyes searched for him in silence, preparing to burst into his world of marble and glass. And that unexpected blow to his routine was about to bring down all of Alexander's certainties. The following morning dawned clear over New York. The sun illuminated the balconies of Fifth Avenue, and the city's bustle contrasted with the icy calm of Alexander's penthouse. He woke early, checked his schedule on his tablet, and dressed in an impeccable gray suit. Everything seemed in order, though he felt that day would be different. As he left the building, he paused for a moment. A group of children played improvised soccer on the corner, laughing loudly. Alexander watched them with a certain nostalgia. He had never shared those moments with his own daughter. With a sigh, he headed to the waiting car. His destination wasn't the office, but a discreet cafe in the West Village, where he was to meet with a foreign investor. The place, with vintage tiles and worn wooden tables, smelled of freshly ground coffee and bagels. Alexander entered with confident steps, greeted the barista, and sat by the window. He ordered a black coffee and opened the newspaper. He had barely read a few lines when he noticed a murmur. A girl about 9 years old watched him from the door. She wore worn clothes and held a drawing notebook. She approached slowly, with fear and determination mixed together. "Mr. Ramirez, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked with a trembling voice. Alexander raised his eyebrows, uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, little one. You've got the wrong person." The girl shook her head firmly and opened the notebook. Among the drawings appeared a worn photograph. A young woman held a little girl in her arms. Alexander lost his breath. He recognized Clara, his late wife. "My mom told me you were my dad," she whispered. "Her name is Lucia. I'm Lucia." Alexander's heart trembled. He observed the girl, the dark hair, the intense gaze, a gesture identical to Clara's. "It can't be," he murmured, bringing his hand to his forehead. "This must be a mistake." The barista passed nearby and Alexander ordered a glass of water. He needed time, but the girl didn't back down. "I'm not mistaken," she insisted. "My brother Diego is also your son. He's outside, but he's afraid." Alexander turned toward the window. A 6-year-old boy waited on the sidewalk, backpack on his shoulder. When their eyes met, he looked down, nervous, as if shame protected him. Alexander's ordered world, built between contracts and travels, swayed. He felt the coffee stick in his throat. He didn't know whether to stand up, flee, or embrace that girl who claimed him as her father. The meeting was forgotten. He took out a bill, left it on the table, and with a trembling voice said, "All right, let's go outside." Lucia took his hand naturally, as if she had always been waiting for that moment. On the street, facing the bustle of the West Village, Alexander found himself face to face with the boy. "Dad," Diego whispered with a thread of a voice. Time seemed to stop. Alexander felt a piercing memory of Clara embracing a baby. He didn't know what secrets were hidden behind it, but what he was living wasn't a mistake. The bells of the nearby church marked noon, and while the city continued its routine, Alexander understood that his had just broken into 1,000 pieces. Alexander walked aimlessly through the streets of the West Village with the 2 children at his side. The city bustled with normalcy. Flower vendors on corners, tourists consulting maps, the smell of spices coming from restaurants. For him, however, everything was tinged with confusion. Lucia didn't let go of his hand, clinging as if she feared he would disappear at any moment, while Diego walked a few steps behind, shy and silent. He decided to take them to a quieter cafe near Washington Square, where he used to meet with old acquaintances. There he ordered 3 glasses of water and some donuts with hot chocolate, trying to buy time to sort out his thoughts. The children looked at each other with that secret language siblings have when they share a common fear. "I want you to tell me the truth," Alexander said with a firm but calm voice. "How did you find me?" Lucia opened her drawing notebook and showed another photograph. In it, Clara appeared smiling with a dedication on the back, written in her own handwriting. "For my daughter Lucia, never forget that your father is in New York." Alexander immediately recognized his late wife's handwriting. He felt a lump in his throat. "Mom told us about you before she died," Lucia explained, swallowing hard. "She told us we had to find you, that you were our father." Diego nodded timidly. His dark eyes, identical to Clara's, conveyed a silent pain. Alexander looked at him for a long while, and for the first time in years felt vulnerable. The barista left the glasses on the table, and seeing the attention, asked if they needed anything else. Alexander thanked him with a gesture, and left him a generous tip, almost automatic, as if money could hide the trembling of his hands. While the children ate in small bites, Alexander remembered Clara in the hospital, her last words, her plea to take care of their daughter. He had believed everything had ended with that loss, but now he understood the story was incomplete. "Where have you been living until now?" he asked. "With Isabel," Lucia answered, lowering her voice. "She said you didn't want to know anything about us." That name resonated like thunder. Isabel. The woman with whom he had shared years after Clara's death, the one who always appeared kind in public, had been the guardian of such an enormous secret. Alexander felt his blood freeze. Memories crowded in. Business trips, prolonged absences, Isabel's excuses to prevent him from getting too close to certain domestic matters. Everything fell into place suddenly. The suspicion transformed into certainty. There was something dark he hadn't wanted to see. Lucia, with tears in her eyes, leaned toward him. "Dad, we just want to be with you. We don't want to go back to her." Diego, in a burst of courage, added, "She treats us badly when you're not there." Alexander's heart broke. He felt rage for not having been present, for having taken refuge in work while his children suffered. A deep guilt mixed with an irrepressible desire to protect them. He stood up from the table suddenly. "Come with me," he ordered with a grave voice. The children followed him without protest. He walked quickly to his car parked on a nearby street and opened the doors. Lucia and Diego settled into the back seat, looking at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Alexander started the engine with determination. He drove toward his home near Central Park. The silence inside the car was dense. Lucia hugged her notebook like a shield. Diego looked out the window with big, bright eyes. Alexander felt trapped between two worlds, that of comfort and success to which he was accustomed, and that of responsibility that now knocked on his door with the force of blood and lost love. Upon arriving at the building, the doorman greeted him surprised to see him accompanied by two children. Alexander didn't explain anything. He went up with them in the elevator to the penthouse. Upon opening the door, the cold marble and bare walls seemed more desolate than ever. The children entered slowly, looking at everything with amazement. "It's so big," Diego whispered. Alexander observed how their small figures seemed lost in that empty space. For the first time, that luxurious penthouse seemed an inhospitable place to him, incapable of offering human warmth. Then, a sharp sound interrupted the moment, the click of heels approaching down the hallway. Isabel appeared in the living room, impeccable in a red dress, with a frozen smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alexander, what a surprise," she said with a sweet voice. "I didn't expect to see you at this hour." Lucia hid behind her father, and Diego lowered his head with evident fear. Alexander saw it and understood he was facing the truth he had avoided so much. The air tensed in the living room. Isabel took another step, but Alexander raised his hand firmly, protecting the children behind him. In that instant, he knew there was no turning back. His life was about to change radically. Isabel stood motionless in the middle of the living room with a petrified smile. The tension could be felt in the air as if the walls themselves held their breath. Alexander didn't take his eyes off her. Behind his back, Lucia and Diego clung to the hem of his jacket. "What are these children doing here?" Isabel asked with a sharp voice, losing all appearance of sweetness. Alexander took a deep breath. "They're my children," he responded with a firmness that surprised even himself. "Why did you hide this from me all this time?" Isabel's face contorted. She took a couple of steps, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're confused, Alexander. That girl is lying. She just wants to take advantage of you." Lucia stepped forward trembling, holding the photograph with her mother's dedication. "I'm not lying. You know it," she said with a broken voice but charged with truth. Isabel snatched it from her hands and crumpled it without regard. Diego shrank back, hiding behind his sister. The gesture unleashed a contained fury in Alexander. "Enough, Isabel!" he shouted, raising his voice for the first time. "I've seen enough." She tried to reply, but Alexander had already dialed a number on his phone. He ordered his lawyer to come that same afternoon. Isabel paled. She understood the mask was falling off and that her world of appearances was about to crumble. The children were led by Alexander to one of the bedrooms. There, among forgotten toys from his deceased daughter, they found momentary comfort. Diego caressed a teddy bear while Lucia observed the city from the window. "Can we really stay here?" she asked with a threat of a voice. Alexander swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll do everything possible to keep you safe." That night he barely slept. He walked through the penthouse in silence, remembering every detail of his life with Clara, every absence, every wrong decision. He felt torn between guilt and the desire to repair the damage. When dawn broke, he had already made a decision. He would go to court to claim custody. The following days were a whirlwind of procedures. Alexander hired the best law firm in New York, gathered evidence, spoke with acquaintances who had seen Isabel with the children. The truth emerged little by little, but Isabel didn't sit idly by. She also hired her own lawyers, determined to defend her reputation. In the midst of all that process, Alexander tried to get closer to Lucia and Diego. He took them for breakfast at a diner in Brooklyn, picked them up from the provisional school where they had been enrolled, and they walked together through Central Park. Every simple gesture, a shared ice cream, an unexpected laugh, a small hand seeking his, reminded him how much he had lost and how much he wanted to recover. However, the children still carried invisible wounds. One afternoon, while walking down Broadway, Diego stopped suddenly and whispered, "I don't want her to yell at us again." Alexander knelt before him, moved. "I'll never allow it again," he said with a firm voice. "I promise you." The trial was approaching. On the day of the hearing, the tension was unbearable. The New York courthouse stood solemn, and the courtroom was full of murmurs. Isabel entered impeccable in a sober dress and with a haughty gaze. Alexander, on the other hand, held his children's hands. The judge, Judge Carmen Alvarez, a woman of serene bearing, opened the session. "Mr. Ramirez, Ms. Ortega, today we will hear the truth." Lucia squeezed her father's hand. Diego breathed in short gasps. Alexander knew that this would be the decisive moment, the instant when his life as a distant businessman would be left behind forever. Isabel's lawyer tried to paint an image of Alexander as an absent man, incapable of taking care of children. But then Mrs. Rosa, the former household employee, appeared in the courtroom with a firm voice. She declared having witnessed Isabel's mistreatment of the little ones. The atmosphere tensed. Isabel shifted in her seat, unable to hide her nervousness. Alexander looked at his children and knew the truth was beginning to come to light. The judge announced a recess. Outside, in the cold hallway full of echoes, Lucia embraced her father. "I'm afraid," she whispered. Alexander held her against his chest. "You're not alone anymore." When they returned to the courtroom, the judge announced she would hear directly from the children. Alexander felt a chill. Everything hung by a thread, and what his children said could change everything. The silence in the courtroom became unbearable when the judge announced she would hear from the children. Lucia and Diego looked at each other with wide eyes. Alexander squeezed their hands tenderly, trying to transmit strength to them. Isabel, seated a few meters away, showed a forced smile that barely hid the tension in her jaw. The judge first called Lucia. The girl walked slowly to the stand with her notebook pressed against her chest. The entire courtroom held its breath. Lucia raised her gaze and spoke with a trembling voice at first, but each word gained clarity. "My mom told me he was my dad," she said, pointing at Alexander. "And she also told me to look for him if I ever needed help." She opened the notebook and showed the photograph with Clara's dedication. The judge observed the image for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Lucia continued, "My brother and I have lived with Isabel, but she doesn't love us. She yells at us, hits us. We were afraid to speak, but I don't want to be silent anymore." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Isabel shifted in her seat, furious, but the judge asked her for silence with a severe gesture. Alexander swallowed hard, moved by his daughter's courage. Then it was Diego's turn. The little one advanced timidly, looking at the floor. His voice was barely a whisper. "I just want my dad to be with us. I don't want to go back to her." The judge took note of every word. Alexander felt his heart tearing as he heard his children reveal so much pain. He promised himself in that instant that he would never again allow them to suffer. Isabel's lawyer tried to discredit the children, claiming they were too young to understand the situation. But then Mrs. Rosa stood up again. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said. "I saw them cry many times. I saw how Isabel left them without food or locked them in their room. These children are telling the truth." The declaration fell like a hammer blow. Isabel lost control and standing up shouted, "They're lying! Everyone's lying!" The judge struck the table firmly. "Ms. Ortega, behave yourself or I'll remove you from the courtroom." Isabel's face became distorted. Her perfect image as an elegant woman had cracked before everyone. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He had loved that woman at some point, but now he clearly saw the darkness she hid. The hearing went on for hours. Finally, the judge announced she would give her resolution the next day. The courtroom slowly emptied. Alexander left with his children, exhausted but hopeful. That night in the penthouse, Lucia fell asleep on the sofa hugging her notebook. Diego curled up next to her, breathing calmly. Alexander watched them for a long while with a tight heart. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry in silence. "Clara," he whispered, looking at an old photo. "Forgive me for having failed. I'll do everything possible to protect them." At dawn, he dressed in a sober suit, without jewelry or ostentation. He didn't want to impress anyone, only to demonstrate he was ready to be a father. The children accompanied him, calmer than the day before, but with eyes full of expectation. Back at the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Isabel tried to regain her composure, though her red eyes betrayed her contained fury. Journalists waited at the entrance, throwing questions that Alexander ignored. The judge appeared with the file in her hands and everyone stood up. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Alexander squeezed Lucia and Diego's hands, feeling that their lives were suspended in that instant. The judge's voice, clear and solemn, filled the courtroom. After hearing the children, the witnesses, and reviewing the evidence presented, this court considers that Mr. Alexander Ramirez is fit to exercise custody. Consequently, the minors Lucia and Diego will remain under his immediate care. An emotional murmur ran through the courtroom. Lucia threw herself into her father's arms. Diego, with tears in his eyes, whispered barely audibly, "Dad, can we go with you now?" Alexander couldn't contain his tears. He hugged them tightly, as if he feared the world would snatch them away again. Isabel, defeated, left the courtroom escorted by her people. Her haughty figure crumbled amid the murmurs of the public. In that instant, Alexander knew nothing would ever be the same. He had recovered his children, but he had also acquired a responsibility that would change his life forever. The judge closed the file with a sharp blow. The courtroom emptied, but Alexander remained there embracing his children. He felt the weight of years of solitude dissipating, replaced by a new strength, that of family. And although obstacles remained to overcome, he knew that day he had taken the first step toward his redemption. The afternoon sun bathed Central Park with a golden light. Alexander walked slowly with Lucia and Diego holding hands. The judge's sentence still resonated in his mind like a liberating echo. The people around him continued with their routines. Tourists, taking photos, elderly people reading newspapers on benches, children running around. But for him, everything was different. It was as if the world had become new. At home, the penthouse stopped being a cold space. Alexander had arranged to place some of Lucia's drawings on the walls, and had brought toys for Diego. The echo of their laughter now filled the hallways that previously seemed empty. The smell of hot chocolate mixed with that of fresh donuts brought from a Brooklyn diner, where they had discreetly celebrated the judicial victory. One afternoon, while dining together on potato omelet and freshly baked bread, Lucia looked at him seriously. "You really won't leave us ever again?" Alexander swallowed hard and held her gaze. "Never again. You're the most important thing in my life." Diego smiled timidly and came closer to hug him. Alexander felt something inside him repairing itself little by little. The guilt was still there, but it no longer dominated him. Now he had the opportunity to rebuild, to give his children what they had always deserved. As the days passed, the relationship filled with small gestures, taking them to school, helping with homework, reading them a story before bed. Each everyday action transformed into an act of love and redemption. Alexander learned from his children as much as they learned from him. One Sunday, they went together to Central Park. Lucia drew the lake with boats, while Diego ran after the pigeons. Alexander watched them with a calm he had never experienced in his years as a businessman. In that instant, he understood that true wealth wasn't in contracts or buildings, but in the laughter of those two children. As evening fell, while they returned home, Lucia whispered in his ear, "Mom would be happy to see us together." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, moved. "I know, sweetheart. And from wherever she is, I'm sure she's smiling at us. Life wouldn't be simple. There would be painful memories, legal procedures, nights of doubt, but there would also be unexpected hugs, shared dinners, and school mornings. And in the midst of it all, the certainty that the family, though broken for years, had reunited. Alexander Ramirez, the man who once believed himself invincible and alone, now walked accompanied. He had learned that true power wasn't measured in money or fame, but in the capacity to love and repair the mistakes of the past. With Lucia and Diego holding hands, he crossed Fifth Avenue, illuminated by the city lights. And while the bells of the nearby church marked the hour, he knew a new life was beginning, that of a redeemed father who had finally found his home. In the echo of that afternoon in New York, while the city lights turned on little by little, the image remained of a father walking hand in hand with his children. After years of silences and guilt, Alexander had understood that nothing in the world could fill the void left by the absence of family love. Perhaps you who listen to these words also feel that life sometimes steals time with our loved ones, and that's why I ask you, if this story seemed valuable to you, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe it could have been told differently, write a 0. Your voice is also part of this dialogue. The lesson is clear: tenderness and redemption have more strength than money or fame. The man who seemed condemned to solitude learned to rebuild a home from the ruins of the past. Because unconditional, love can change destinies. And because everyone, regardless of mistakes, deserves a second chance to love and be loved. Like a lamp lit in the window during the night, a single gesture of kindness can guide us through life's darkest hallways. Now, dear listener, stop for an instant and think. What place does family occupy in your own story? What footprints do? You want to leave when the years pass and memory is your best companion? The true treasure isn't in bank accounts, nor in contracts, nor in titles hanging on the wall. It's in shared hugs, in sincere smiles, in those small routines that remind us we're not alone. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to keep it in memory like a soft melody that accompanies your days. And if you wish, share it. Perhaps someone else needs to remember that you can always start over, because life, in the end, is measured in the moments we choose to live for others.